On today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, is 2023 going to be the first time in a long time an Eagles quarterback does not have a big drop-off after a career year? Plus, some early training camp predictions on roster battles, more like starting battles, and also, we're seeing a lot of roster rankings across the NFL. It's putting San Francisco ahead of Philadelphia. We'll get into all that and more in this Friday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
For making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to a Friday edition of the show. This episode is sponsored by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Gino Camilleri, Louie DiBiase right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shout out to the everydayers for making us your first listen Monday through Friday. Gino, we're one day away from July. Before you know it, training camp is going to be here. Less than a month away now, and that's really exciting. We're going to get into some early predictions before the players have hit the field at NovaCare Complex. We're going to get into some early camp battles, our predictions when it comes to the starting jobs up for grabs on offense and defense. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about quarterback, because I was thinking about Jalen Hurts the other day. I don't even know what it stemmed from. I think it was when Jason Kelce was talking about how Hurts still beats himself up about that Super Bowl 57 performance, probably the fumble, and Kelce told him, you have nothing to worry about. You know, you had one of the best performances from an individual in Super Bowl history. But I started to think about that, how Hurts is going to try to get even better this year and look at the history of this position for Philadelphia and what these guys did after career years. And it's crazy. I mean, we know they haven't had a sustainable franchise quarterback since Donovan McNabb. But, you know, to see how consistently a quarterback has had a huge year in Philly and then had a significant drop-off the following year, it has happened pretty much every time since McNabb in the early 2000s. And this might be the first time in 2 decades where a quarterback has a really good year and doesn't significantly regress. And I think that's going to be the case, but it has not been the case since, honestly, I was doing the research with statistics from a stat perspective since like 2000 to 2001.
When you talk about Donovan, though, you have to give him his respects when it comes to consistency, right? And that was the one area that even with the huge season that he did have in his career year, he was still marginally close to those numbers, right? But when you look at Nick Foles, Carson Wentz, Michael Vick's best year, man, they dropped off a cliff the following season, right? And the thing you hope for with Jalen is that it's somewhat close to the numbers that he had this year.
Right.
And if that completion percentage is close and the accuracy looks relatively the same and the interception and touchdown numbers are just skewed a little bit, and the touchdown numbers, I would like to see a little bit of a change from rushing to touchdown and with a couple more of those.
I agree.
But if Jalen falls off a cliff, Lou, so does your team. And I understand why Jalen holds himself and beats himself up about that Super Bowl loss, is because he holds this team higher than anything, right? And he knows that as I go, he'll never say that, as he goes, though, so does the team. So if you are going to bet on a player to quote unquote have a bounce back after that last outing that he had, right? And with a team that has surrounded him with the talent and the players that seem to mesh very well with him, when you look at those other teams with Nick Foles, right, that was a flash in the pan season where a lot of things were changing. Players moved off the roster. Carson Wentz was just an enemy of himself. Michael Vick was the last couple years of a Chip Kelly regime that would ultimately fail.
And the end of Andy Reid, too.
Andy Reid. So
yeah.
He was in a mix of everything. With Jalen Hurts, you have the same coach, a coordinator that was your quarterback coach last season that you have known since you were a kid. You're going to have the same 2 wide receivers that you had last year with Dallas Goedert. You're only losing 1 player on the offensive line, and arguably you have as much depth at the running back position. Jalen, just go be Jalen. You just have to do that to 100%. Get to that floor, which was last year, in my opinion. That's a floor season for Jalen Hurts.
No, I agree. And Gino, I think, you look at why this has happened, because even with Donovan McNabb, like his career year in 2004, look what happened in 2005. We all know T.O. wasn't on the field for half the year, but McNabb only plays in 9 games. He gets hurt. His completion percentage goes down from 64% to 59. A 31-8 touchdown to interception ratio goes down to 16-9. 8.8 yards per attempt to 6.8. Even Donovan, I guess you could say 2008 and 2009 were pretty solid years back to back, but when a guy had like a career high type of season, they have not bounced back and made it almost as strong, if not better, since Donovan in 2000 to 2001, his second year, and then to his third year. So even Donovan sometimes couldn't string along, like when he becomes elite, he couldn't, and it's really hard, obviously I'm not expecting Jalen Hurts this year to put up all the same numbers as last year, but these other guys weren't able to sustain it even a little bit. I guess the closest, honestly, would be Carson in 2018 and 2019, and we all saw that he wasn't the same player, even in an amazing finish of a 2019 season. I mean, look at like Michael Vick, 2010 to 2011. Completion percentage, 62% to 59, 21-6 ratio to 18 to 14. Foles in 2013, 64% down to 59 in 2014. 27-2 ratio down to 13 and 10. And then we all know about Carson. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why this happened. Some of them just weren't as good as we originally thought. But, I think you made a good point. It's the support system around them, for many reasons, wasn't very sustainable. But they also, I don't think, put in the work themselves to be sustainable like Jalen has when it comes to not just relying on physical gifts, right, outside of structure plays where Michael Vick, what did he always do? He just relied on his mobility. Carson Wentz, outside of structure, that's what he would do. They stuck to their strengths, and they never really worked on their weaknesses as much. Whereas Jalen, we saw it last year, has, and I think he'll continue to do that, and that's how you become sustainable in the league. It's, here are my strengths, but I'm going to also work on my weaknesses. So, it's complex as to why each case it's an individual, unique story, but I think a lot of it is pretty much the same. And for those guys relying on those skills, it often got them injured. And that, you look at all of them, that's definitely a consistent theme. Even with Nick Foles, was they all kept getting hurt.
I don't think the word is they didn't work as much as more. They
I don't want
to.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I shouldn't say they were lazy because I think all of them definitely did. But yes, they didn't adapt as much as they relied too much on the strengths rather than like completely fixing the weaknesses. And Jalen last year, I mean, look at his accuracy improvement, the pocket progression, ball placement, everything.
And hence why that might be a little bit tougher in Philadelphia, Lou, because if you look at what they've asked quarterbacks to do over the last 2 decades, is not what every team has asked their players to do, right? And if you look at Drew Brees, who I think is a model of consistency at a very high level, if you look at his last 5 or 6 years, all of those numbers, completion percentage, basically identical year after year after year with yards and touchdowns and interceptions. And the thing with Jalen Hurts is maybe he never gets to that level as a passer, right, where he's passing for 5,000 yards. But if last year was the floor and you could expect him to get to that level, you have to copy what you did last year, but also at the same time, like we said with the other guys, adapt. He has to adapt his game. If he wants to remain successful, he has to adapt. Even Josh Allen, who everybody knows he is an unbelievable runner. Some of the plays that he has made over the last couple of years, just willing the Bills into existence at times. They know that he's not going to be a
Baltimore
Drew Brees type of player.
Baltimore too. I mean, they know
Lou.
they have to adapt, or Lamar's not going to be playing for another 5 years. So they're seeming like they're going to a more pass-heavy offense this year, where they're bringing in all these weapons. Interesting, Gino. Yeah, I agree with you. It's not that I'm not saying his numbers are gonna look so much better than last year. I thought last year was the best individual season an Eagles quarterback has ever had, even over Wentz 2017, Vick 2010, McNabb 2004. But there are some numbers that could improve, like I think his passing yardage, if he stays healthier this year, he only threw for 3,701 yards last year. He should be over 4,000, I think, this year if they pass more and he stays healthy. You mentioned passing touchdowns. He only had 22 last year. You would hope that rushing comes down a little bit. Those passing touchdowns, those improve. So I think, those numbers could definitely. And even his completion percentage, man, 66.5 is pretty damn good. But would you be surprised if that improved a little bit? I wouldn't.
No, not at all. And especially in today's game, too, where it is favored to the wide receiver. When I'm talking about Drew Brees, his completion percentage numbers were almost 70% at times. And those early years were in a league where the rules weren't as skewed towards wide receivers in favoring the pass game. So if you could get to that level of 4,000 yards a year in the air, Lou, hence why I'm saying last year should be the floor, because that's an average season, 3,700 to 4,000 yards in the air for a player like Jalen Hurts. If you're saying that that's his best season, is that the best season he's ever going to have? And if he can even remain at that level, that's going to be able to win.
No, but
from numbers, no. But
I will say the way he
winning,
played, it's going to be. I mean, he was incredible.
I know we don't count quarterback wins, but the way he won, the way his ball placement was, the way he just understood timing.
He was number one in almost every pocket passing statistic last year.
Decrease year over year. That's the part I'm trying.
Yeah, and that's my point. Again, I'm not going to expect this rapid increase in everything he does. I want it to, all I'm talking about is sustaining what he did last year. 100%. And, other quarterbacks too don't always, Aaron Rodgers with an MVP year, or like Patrick Mahomes in 2018. Was he like 2019? He wasn't, he was pretty much as good. He wasn't who he was in 2018. Just from, again, like when you're an MVP, you're not going to every single year have that kind of year where you're throwing for 50 touchdowns. But Mahomes' like drop off, quote unquote, is barely anything. And that's the thing with Jalen is these other guys, they did have significant drop-offs. Even Carson Wentz. In 2018, that was a big drop-off to me. From a numbers perspective, it wasn't. But performance-wise, you knew that wasn't the same guy. With Jalen this year, from a numbers perspective and from just the eye test of seeing him out there, I don't think that drop-off's going to come. And we haven't seen that after a career year from an Eagles quarterback in a long time, honestly, in 20 plus years. So that's, I think, exciting, and we got to see it happen. But I think with Jalen, you should definitely be confident. All right, let's move forward. Let's talk some training camp, Gino, coming up next. We've got some starting battles that are going to be considered, I think, starting jobs up for grab on both sides of the ball. Early predictions on those battles coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. And guys, today's show is sponsored by FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. It's $200 you can then spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to get that first home run, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. The Phillies are on the come up. I've been making some money. I was a little doubtful. I should have been after last year's come up too. So this is just what the Phillies do every single year in the NL East. There's no better place to bet on the Phillies, the MLB, and more at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get up to $200 in bonus bets. It's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Eagles fans, we are continuing on this Friday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Shout out to the Everydayers for making us your first listen. Gino, training camp coming up before you know it. We're going to be there, NovaCare Complex. The players are going to be on the field. And this roster, incredible still. There's not a ton of turnover from the 2022 team, but there are some starting jobs that are up for grabs. A couple on offense, a few on defense as well. And before they do hit the field, do you have any, inclination right now, or who you would lean towards, predict, not who you would want to win the job, but when it comes to right guard, that battle, or the third receiver spot, who's the lead workhorse running back, not even a workhorse, but the lead in the committee, or safety too on defense? Who are some of the guys that you're leading towards before camp even gets going? Who are the favorites?
I would say the favorites have to come at right guard for me. And I would say out of all positions, I think Cam Jurgens might be the most inclined to win his position thoroughly and without much challenge, because behind him, is it going to be Jack Driscoll? I think the team kind of has identified what they think of Jack. And
yeah, I think it'd be Steen, if anything.
He was a great journeyman player, and he'll be out of Philadelphia after this year, but they're going to use him as a swing type of player. But Tyler Steen happens to be the future, but is the future right now. I give the favor to Cam Jurgens, who's putting on a little bit of weight. He moves well. You know that he is going to be asked to do a lot of athletic things on the line. Well, you saw what he can do in game experience last year that Tyler Steen doesn't have. Tyler Steen is a year behind the 8 ball because he happened to get drafted a year after Cam Jurgens. And no offense to his own, but Cam just seems to be a very favorable player in Philadelphia. I would say the one that I have absolutely no idea about, I think safety. I think, how are they going to deploy them? Are they going to deploy two guys evenly and just be a two high cover scheme? I can't see that happening.
Do they use a lot of three safeties, Gino, too? Like
Exactly. If you go big, heavy nickel, what are you going to do?
If Morrow isn't the guy, or if they don't want to use two linebackers as much as they did last year, there might be, I don't even know if there is a battle. It might be Sidney Brown, back deep with three Blankenship and, Edmonds roaming around the front.
I think that one will be the biggest committee approach when it comes to the defensive side of the ball. I think linebackers pretty simple. It's going to be Nakobe Dean playing every single snap. Morrow will be the number 2. Shouldn't be much competition there. Outside of that, Christian Ellis isn't going to really give you much competition. Sean Bradley, maybe he's an outlier there, but I don't think anybody's going to really challenge that spot. The committee approach on offense, though, is clearly the running back position. I would have to say DeAndre Swift is going to be a heavy favorite right away.
I agree.
Simply because what he can do in the pass game.
And I think they want to keep Penny healthy, Gino, too. So it's almost to benefit Rashad Penny that they don't. And again, it's going to be a committee where I think all 4 guys are going to play a lot, right? I think Swift, Penny, Gainwell, and Scott. But I think to also help Penny make it through the entire season, they'll probably have Swift as the guy.
And I think they have clearly identified that as being one of the reasons maybe he hasn't made it through a season. When Seattle has these running backs, man, they just give him the ball, right? Like, look at Kenneth Walker after he goes in for Rashad Penny. They just kept giving him the football. If you give Rashad Penny 7-8 touches on the ground, just ease him into this season and just let him get his feet back under him, it's going to pay off dividends in the long run. And the way they talk about Kenny Gainwell, you should put some stock in his name as well. He could surprise people and arguably be the number 2 there. But right now, DeAndre Swift, in my opinion, is the most complete player, the most explosive when it comes to overall explosiveness, both in the run and passing game. And he is going to be one of those guys that you don't know what they are doing when they're in the football game, which they have to figure out at the running back position.
Whereas like Kenny G, you kind of know, when he's out there in third down, they're going to throw the football, especially, he's had such a big role in the 2-minute drill over the last 2 years.
Definitely.
You know what's going down there. I think, right guard is the interesting one to me because, again, safety, you think you pretty much know. They're going to run a lot of 3 safety sets. I think all 3 are going to be on the field. They eventually want Sidney Brown to be your new CGJ, I think, deep in the backfield. Receiver even, too. I think they want Quez Watkins to win it, but it's going to be a rotation even more than last year with Olamide Zacchaeus. Running back going to be a committee. Right guard's interesting because there's a few different approaches you could take. I don't think they want Cam Jurgens to be basically redshirted for 2 years in a row, especially if he's going to be the guy eventually to replace Jason Kelce. So they probably want him on the field. And if they want another athlete out there that can get upfield, the second and third level, as you mentioned, that's Jurgens way more than Tyler Steen. But I will say at the same time, Tyler Steen presents more size and power, and I think the Eagles like having a break. Like, he's been getting, and it's, Jason Kelce said this and somebody else too, and they tried to lower expectations saying, we don't think he's this guy, but he reminds us a lot stylistically of a Brandon Brooks. And with Jason Kelce's size, you might want a bigger, more powerful guard there. So, and if he's the long-term right guard as well of the future, you might want him to keep working at that spot, and Jurgens is, still focused on center. So it's a unique situation at right guard. I would agree probably Jurgens is the favorite, but I actually think Tyler Steen has a chance. And this isn't some 5th or 6th round pick. I mean, this is a initial 3rd rounder, but pretty much a 2nd round pick.
No, that's fair. I might have looked at that situation a little bit more single-mindedly than you did because of Cam Jurgens, but you have to look at what Tyler Steen does present, right? And that has been one of the areas of pushback. Is Cam Jurgens really a right guard? Because like you said, look at Brandon Brooks. This dude's a 335 pound
Kelce
guy.
and Jurgens next to each other? I mean,
you're giving up size. You're giving up a lot of size there.
You made a good point though too. Like, Jurgens is such a better athlete though than Steen that if you have another guy like that out there, and it's not like
he does have raw power though. We got
right. And it's not like he's that much smaller than Isaac Seumalo.
No, not too much at all. And that's the better comparison, right? Because you could go to Brandon Brooks and be like, we got to compare everybody to this guy. But Brandon Brooks, if healthy, is a first ballot Hall of Famer any day of the week. And he's one of the best
at his
right
ceiling,
guards ever.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you're not going to get that level of play, but could you get level of play close to Isaac Seumalo? Absolutely. But you got to take the money ball approach here. Do we want to give up some size to get more athleticism? Do we want to give up a little bit more experience to get that youth to kind of
maybe it's
train
right
him?
Guard by committee, Gino, and it just depends on the look.
maybe this is the biggest competition spot and we're overlooking it. And maybe it is truly a
Oh, I
Jordan
think it is.
Mailata and Andre Dillard situation.
I think it definitely could be, because outside of that position, I mean, the other ones you pretty much have a good sense for what's going to happen. Sidney Brown is going to be the long-term answer, I think, at safety, but right now I think Blankenship and Edmonds are totally the favorites at that spot, and I think you can clearly look at the favorites everywhere. But yeah, right guard, there's just a lot of different ways to go about it, and I would love to hear what Jeff Stoutland's thinking, like what his brain right now is thinking about trying to draw stuff up there for sure. All right, Gino, we'll wrap up the show. Coming up next, I've seen a lot of roster rankings across the NFL media landscape right now, and some of them are putting the 49ers ahead of the Eagles when it comes to the strength of their team. We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, Eagles fans, we're continuing on this Friday edition of Locked On Eagles. Gino, it's the dead zone of the NFL offseason. Not a whole lot going on, so this is the rankings part of the offseason, right? And, media, they got to create content some way, and so what you're seeing a lot from Pro Football Focus, ESPN, The Athletic, it goes on and on, NFL Network, every podcast you can think of, they're doing rankings, and they're just trying to get through until training camp starts up. And I've been seeing a lot of roster rankings that I think most would agree. The Chiefs are the favorite to win it all this year, as they should. They have the big three of Mahomes, Reed, and Kelsey. But when it comes to who has the strongest overall roster, I think the consensus, the majority, it's Philadelphia and San Francisco. But I keep seeing San Fran ahead of Philly, and it is like basically 1 and 2, so it's not like you're kind of splitting hairs. But honestly, for me, I don't know where the Niners are getting the advantage where you'd put them ahead of the Eagles.
Well, it's not on the offensive line. They lose Mike McGlinchey, right? And I don't even think they had a better offensive line with Mike McGlinchey. And we know Trent Williams.
It was closer, but
is Trent Williams, but he's not as good as the Eagles' whole offensive line that loses maybe their weakest link out of everybody in their offensive line last year. And I'd say corner, definitely Philadelphia. Safety, safety and linebacker, I would say definitely
I think
Seattle.
it's the positions that don't matter as much.
Yeah.
San Fran has the advantage at linebacker and running back, to me, are the main ones for the 49ers. And probably safety. But everything else is pretty close. Even you look at the defensive line, but I think I take the Eagles defensive line over them. Receiver, like weapons, very close. Kittle, Ayuk, and Debo, pretty close, but I'd probably rather have Brown, Devontae, and Goddard, right? I think Brown over Debo. Devontae's slight edge over Ayuk, and I think Goddard and Kittle are basically 2A, 2B when it comes to tight end behind Travis Kelce. So, and quarterback, I mean, that's the main thing. Like, how you can ever put San Fran on there when that's the biggest drop-off is at the most important position. That's why, to me, everybody should be picking the Eagles over San Francisco. It's close for sure. It's not like it's 1 versus 7. It's definitely 1 versus 2, but quarterback is the main spot. It's like it's Jalen Hurts versus who knows this year. Who knows every year with that team.
It's like the Formula One topic that I always bring up, that you're looking at cars, right? And you're looking at Jalen's car and it's all nice and polished, and that's the Eagles. And then you look over at a car and it's just the wheels and the inside and the suspension. And you're like, that's San Francisco. Everything else inside looks great, but the outside stuff, the stuff that really takes you where you're supposed to be, the quarterback position, is the biggest drop-off. So give me the conversation of some of the rosters that, I would say Cincinnati has a pretty deep roster. Their offensive line has gotten substantially better over the last 2 years. Their defense is excellent. I think the Chargers have a very deep roster as well. You can make the case that there's multiple AFC rosters that are better than NFC rosters, and there's not many very good AFC rosters or NFC rosters rather. And I look at Buffalo, and I look at some of these teams that are so top heavy,
so much better.
And why can't you leave those teams out of the conversation, Lou? Because of the quarterback position. Well, it just elevates everything else.
Yeah, I think the Eagles have a slight edge almost at every other spot, but then they have such a huge edge at quarterback. And it's not like I'm seeing like 800 articles where it's the Niners over the Eagles, but I've seen quite a few over the last few weeks. And again, the only significant advantages, I would say, or maybe not significant, clear, to me, is running back and linebacker for San Fran. It's Christian McCaffrey and it's Fred Warner. The Eagles definitely do not have those two guys right now, although I really like Nakobe Dean, so we'll see. But yeah, those are really the only two spots. Even like safety, I can't even remember. I'm just drawing a blank. The Niners starting safeties. I mean, it's not like they have like
Ward
stars. So it's not like they have like they're loaded in the secondary. I'm sure it is an advantage over Edmonds, Blankenship, and Sidney Brown, but is it?
And when you have that conversation too, you also have to include the depth of it too. I mean, the Eagles are so deep all over the board, and the guys you were looking for, Lou, were Tashawn Gibson and Hufanga. I was drawing a blank on that. I just drove 24 hours straight.
They're fine. They're not great though. I mean, like, that's okay.
I mean, and then cornerback, I don't even think it's relatively close. I think Avante is a top 5 player at his position as well, and the other two are top 10s. And defensive line, give me the Eagles' depth over anybody and maybe any position group in the NFL. And the second best position group is the Eagles' offensive line, which I put right there with their defense.
PFF ranked them both. The Eagles have the number 1 offensive line heading into this year and the number 1 defensive line.
As I always say, though, Lou, to make the positive out of it, the fact that we can have these conversations and give me the depth conversation. Anybody can compare stars, right? But when you look at why the Denver Nuggets ultimately won the NBA championship, Lou, I mean, their stars were great, but when their bench players had to come in and their
our own team that we covered, the Super Bowl they won in 2017.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, go back to that team, right? That's what we're talking about. Look at San Fran. You can win these debates, but if it comes February and old boy at the quarterback helm goes down, nothing else. It doesn't matter how many Javon Hargraves you signed for $21 million. It doesn't matter if that position.
If Trey Lance or Brock Purdy or Sam Darnold don't pan out, I'm with you. The Eagles, it's going to be the same thing, even if they play. Yeah, I totally agree. All right, Gino, we'll be back next Monday for another edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shout out to the everydayers. We'll be back for 5 shows next week. Training camp coming up. July puts us back in full gear as we're going to preview the Eagles training camp starting in 3 weeks at the NovaCare Complex. Cannot wait for Philadelphia Eagles football to start up. Big summer guy, but more of a football guy for sure. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. As always, thank you for downloading, thank you for watching and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.